The sound of my bedroom door slamming shut still echoes in my ears 3 months later. I can still see the smug expression on my 24-year-old son's face as he stood there with his girlfriend's suitcases in hand, telling me I had 1 hour to pack my things and find somewhere else to sleep, in my own house. The house I had worked 3 jobs to pay for, the house where I had raised him as a single mother for over 2 decades, the house that held every memory of our life together. But what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about my son, about sacrifice, and about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and until that devastating Tuesday in September, I thought I knew my son better than anyone else in the world. I had given up my dreams of becoming a nurse, my social life, and countless opportunities to ensure that Danny had everything he needed to succeed. At 52, I was proud of the man I had raised, proud of his college degree, proud of his job at the tech startup downtown. I thought we had an unbreakable bond forged through years of just the two of us against the world. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but love has a way of making us blind to the flaws in the people we care about most. It started when Danny brought Chloe home for the first time about 8 months ago. She was 22, blonde, and had this way of looking around our modest 2-bedroom house in Sacramento like she was surveying a crime scene. Our home wasn't fancy, but it was clean, comfortable, and filled with memories. The walls were covered with Danny's childhood artwork, his school achievements, and photos of our little family adventures to local parks and free museums. Chloe never said anything directly critical, but I noticed how she would wrinkle her nose when she walked into the kitchen, how she would sit on the edge of the couch like she was afraid it might contaminate her designer clothes. She came from money. That much was obvious from her expensive handbags and the way she casually mentioned her parents' vacation home in Tahoe. Danny had never brought anyone home before, so I tried my best to welcome her, to make her feel like part of our family. The first red flag should have been when she started suggesting changes to the house during her second visit. She mentioned how much brighter the living room would look with new paint, how the kitchen could really use an update, how the master bedroom had such great potential if someone just knew how to decorate it properly. I brushed off these comments as enthusiasm, thinking maybe she was trying to help, trying to show that she cared about our home. Danny seemed different around her, more anxious to please, more critical of things that had never bothered him before. He started making comments about how we should really invest in some new furniture, how it was embarrassing that we still had the same couch from when he was in high school. These words stung because I knew he understood exactly why we had kept that couch for so long. Money had always been tight, and every dollar I earned went toward his education, his clothes, his future. I had started working at the grocery store when Danny was just 3 years old, after his father walked out on us with nothing but a note saying he wasn't ready for the responsibility of fatherhood. The early years were the hardest, juggling work schedules with daycare pickup times, staying up late to help with homework after working double shifts, choosing between buying groceries and paying for his school supplies. There were nights when I would sit at our kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how to stretch $20 for the rest of the week. But we made it work, Danny and I. We had traditions that didn't cost money, like Friday night movie marathons with microwave popcorn, Saturday morning pancakes shaped like his favorite cartoon characters, and Sunday walks through the neighborhood, where we would make up stories about the people living in the houses we passed. He was my little sidekick, my reason for getting up every morning, my motivation to keep pushing forward when everything felt impossible. As he grew older, I picked up additional part-time jobs to pay for his soccer league fees, his school trip to the science museum, his graduation cap and gown. When he decided he wanted to go to college, I took out a second mortgage on the house and worked at a restaurant on weekends in addition to my grocery store job. I wanted him to have opportunities I never had, to build a life that wouldn't require the constant financial stress that had defined my own existence. The day he graduated from college with his computer science degree, I cried tears of pure joy and exhaustion. We had done it together, beaten the odds, proved that a single mother and her son could accomplish anything with enough determination and love. Danny hugged me so tight that day and whispered in my ear that he would never forget everything I had sacrificed for him, that he was going to take care of me now that he had a real job. For the first year after graduation, things felt perfect. Danny got his position at the startup, moved back home to save money, and we fell into a comfortable routine. He would bring me coffee in the mornings before work, we would watch our favorite cooking shows together in the evenings, and on weekends we would explore different neighborhoods in Sacramento, dreaming about the future. He talked about how he was going to buy us a bigger house someday, how he wanted to send me on a vacation to Italy, how he was finally going to be the one taking care of me for a change. Then Chloe entered our lives, and everything began to shift in ways I couldn't initially understand. The changes were subtle at first. Danny started working later hours, spending more time at her apartment across town, coming home only to sleep and change clothes. Our evening conversations became shorter, our weekend adventures less frequent. He seemed distracted, always checking his phone, always having somewhere else he needed to be. When they had been dating for about 4 months, Chloe started spending more time at our house. She would arrive with an overnight bag on Friday evenings and wouldn't leave until Sunday night. I tried to make her feel welcome, cooking her favorite meals, giving her space to spread out her things, even rearranging my schedule to give them privacy. But nothing I did seemed to be enough. She always had suggestions for improvements, always seemed dissatisfied with something about our home. The complaints started small and seemingly innocent. She mentioned that the water pressure in the shower was low, that the air conditioning didn't seem to cool the house evenly, that the internet connection in the bedroom was spotty. Danny would jump to address each concern, promising to call a plumber, to look into upgrading our HVAC system, to upgrade our internet package. I watched him scramble to fix problems that had never bothered us before, spending money we didn't really have to make her comfortable. Then the suggestions became more pointed. Chloe started talking about how cramped the house felt with 3 adults, how she needed more space for her things, how difficult it was to feel settled when she was just a guest. She would make these comments in front of Danny, looking at him, meaningfully, waiting for him to respond. I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed her words, as he started to see our home through her critical eyes. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Sunday evening in late August. Chloe had spent the entire weekend at our house, and I could tell she was frustrated about something. She kept sighing dramatically, moving restlessly from room to room, making comments about how she couldn't wait to get back to her own space where she could actually relax. Danny was following her around like a lost puppy, asking what was wrong, trying to figure out how to make her happy. Finally, she sat him down at our kitchen table and laid out her concerns in a way that sounded reasonable but felt like a knife to my heart. She explained that she loved spending time with him, but that it was difficult to feel like they had a real relationship when they were always under his mother's roof, always having to be quiet in the mornings, always having to share space with someone else. She talked about how important it was for couples to have their own space, to be able to build intimacy without feeling like they were being watched or judged. I was in the living room, pretending to watch television but actually listening to every word. I felt sick to my stomach as I heard Danny agreeing with her points, apologizing for the inconvenience, promising to find a solution. Part of me wanted to march into that kitchen and defend myself, to remind them both of everything I had sacrificed to give Danny the life he had. But another part of me understood that he was 24 years old and deserved to have adult relationships, without his mother hovering nearby. The next morning, Danny approached me with what he called a reasonable compromise. He suggested that maybe it was time for me to consider getting my own place, something smaller and more manageable for a single woman in her 50s. He talked about how it would be good for both of us to have our independence, how it would give me a chance to focus on myself for the first time in decades. He even offered to help me look for apartments, to help me move, to contribute to my security deposit. I was stunned by his suggestion, not because it was necessarily unreasonable, but because of how casually he was discussing me leaving the home I had worked so hard to maintain. This house represented 20 years of sacrifice, of choosing utility, bills over new clothes for myself, of fixing things with duct tape and determination rather than hiring professionals. Every room held memories of Danny's childhood, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, of late-night conversations when he had his heart broken by his first girlfriend. But I also understood that he was trying to build a life with Chloe, and I didn't want to be the obstacle standing in the way of his happiness. I told him I would think about it, that maybe he was right about both of us needing more independence. I spent the next few days looking at rental listings online, calculating whether my grocery store income would be enough to cover rent and utilities somewhere else. The numbers were discouraging, and most of the places I could afford were in neighborhoods I wouldn't feel safe walking to my car at night. A week later, Danny came to me with what he presented as an even better solution. Instead of me moving out and him taking over the mortgage payments, he suggested that I could move into the smaller guest bedroom, and he and Chloe could take the master bedroom. He explained that they needed more space for their things, that the master bedroom had the larger closet and the ensuite bathroom that would make sharing space more practical. The guest bedroom was barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser. It had been Danny's room when he was younger, before he outgrew the twin bed and moved into the larger room. The idea of cramming my life into that tiny space while they spread out in the room I had slept in for over 15 years felt like another small humiliation, another way of being pushed to the margins of my own life. But I agreed to this arrangement too, telling myself that it was temporary, that they would probably get their own place once they had saved enough money, that I was being a supportive mother by helping them through this transitional period. I spent a weekend moving my clothes and personal belongings into the guest room, trying to fit a lifetime of memories into a space that felt more like a closet than a bedroom. Living in that tiny room was harder than I had anticipated. I could hear everything that happened in the master bedroom, from their late-night conversations to their morning alarms, to sounds I really didn't want to hear from my adult son and his girlfriend. The walls in our house were thin, and privacy was virtually non-existent. I started wearing headphones most of the time, trying to give them space while also protecting my own sanity. Chloe seemed happier with this arrangement, but she still found things to complain about. She didn't like that I kept my morning routine of making coffee at 6, claiming that the noise from the kitchen woke her up. She suggested that maybe I could start my day a little later, or perhaps make my coffee the night before and drink it cold. She didn't like that I watched television in the living room in the evenings, saying that the sound carried throughout the house and made it difficult for them to relax in their bedroom. Slowly but surely, I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, trying to minimize my presence, trying to make myself invisible so that they could live their lives without being reminded that I was still there. I started eating dinner earlier, so they could have the kitchen to themselves. I began staying later at work so they could have the house to themselves in the afternoons. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was becoming a ghost in the home I had worked so hard to create and maintain. The final straw came on that terrible Tuesday in September. I had taken the day off work because I wasn't feeling well, just a minor cold that had been draining my energy for a few days. I was resting in the guest bedroom when I heard Danny and Chloe come home earlier than usual. They were having an intense conversation in the hallway, and I could hear the frustration in both their voices. Chloe was talking about how suffocated she felt living in a house with his mother, how she couldn't relax or feel at home when she was constantly aware of my presence. She said that she felt like they were playing house rather than actually building, A life together that she needed to know they could function as an independent couple without me hovering in the background. Danny's responses were getting more defensive and more critical of our living situation. He was agreeing with her assessment, apologizing for the inconvenience, promising that something had to change. I heard him say that he was tired of feeling like a child in his mother's house, tired of having to consider my feelings before making decisions about his own life. Then I heard footsteps approaching the guest bedroom, followed by a firm knock on my door. When I opened it, Danny was standing there with a look I had never seen before, a mixture of determination and something that looked almost like anger. Behind him, Chloe was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, watching our interaction with cold calculation. Danny took a deep breath and delivered the words that would shatter my world. He told me that he and Chloe had decided they needed the guest bedroom for Chloe's home office, that she was starting to do freelance graphic design work and needed a dedicated workspace. He said that unfortunately, this meant I would need to find somewhere else to live, that it was time for all of us to have our own independence. When I asked him where exactly he expected me to go, he suggested that maybe I could stay with my sister in Phoenix temporarily, or perhaps find a studio apartment somewhere nearby. He talked about this like it was a simple logistical problem rather than him asking his mother to leave the home she had maintained and paid for while raising him alone. I tried to explain that this was my house, that I had the mortgage papers, to prove it, that I couldn't just pack up and leave overnight. Danny's response was what broke my heart completely. He said that while the house might legally be mine, he and Chloe were the ones actually building a future together, and they needed space to do that without interference from previous generations. Previous generations, as if I were some ancient relic from a bygone era, rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him the opportunities that led to this moment. When I tried to suggest that maybe they should be the ones to find their own place, Chloe finally spoke up. She said that it made more sense for me to relocate since I was just one person and they were a couple planning a future together. She pointed out that I was getting older and probably didn't need as much space anyway, that this was an opportunity for me to downsize and simplify my life. The casual cruelty of her words was stunning. She was talking about my life like it was excess baggage that needed to be disposed of, like my 24 years of history in this house were irrelevant compared to their 8-month relationship. But what hurt most was watching Danny nod along with her reasoning, seeing him treat me like an obstacle to his happiness, rather than the person who had made his happiness possible. The little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to hold my hand when we walked through the grocery store, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world, was standing in my doorway telling me to find somewhere else to live. I asked for time to process this request, to figure out my options, to understand how we had gotten to this point. Danny said I could have 1 week to make arrangements, that they needed to know I was taking this seriously and making concrete plans to relocate. 1 week to dismantle a life I had spent over 2 decades building. That night, I lay in the tiny guest bedroom listening to them celebrate in the master bedroom, hearing them make plans for how they would redecorate once I was gone, how they would use the guest room as Chloe's office, how much more comfortable they would be with the entire house to themselves. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I had raised a son who could treat me with such casual disregard, how the boy I had loved more than my own life could look me in the eye and ask me to disappear from his world. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching apartments and temporary housing options. The reality of my financial situation was sobering. My grocery store salary was enough to help maintain the house I already owned, but it wasn't enough to cover rent, utilities, and security deposits for a new place. Most of the apartments I could afford were in neighborhoods I wouldn't feel safe in, and many of them required income verification that I couldn't provide. I also realized that leaving the house would mean abandoning the mortgage I had been paying faithfully for 15 years. If I moved out and couldn't continue making payments, we would lose the house to foreclosure, and Danny would lose his inheritance along with his free place to live. I wondered if he had considered these practical implications, or if he was so focused on keeping Chloe happy that he hadn't thought through the consequences of his demands. By the third day, I had made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of scrambling to find a place to live, I decided to call my sister Maria in Phoenix and ask if I could visit for a few weeks while I figured out my next steps. Maria had been urging me to come see her for years, and she immediately agreed to let me stay in her guest room while I sorted through this situation. I didn't tell Danny about my plans immediately. Instead, I watched him and Chloe over the next few days, studying their interactions, trying to understand what had really changed in my son's heart. I noticed how anxious he seemed whenever Chloe appeared dissatisfied with something, how quickly he jumped to address her concerns, how his mood seemed entirely dependent on her approval. On Friday evening, I announced that I had made arrangements to visit my sister for a few weeks, that I would be leaving on Sunday morning and wasn't sure when I would be back. I expected Danny to show some emotion about this news, some regret or concern about me leaving indefinitely. Instead, he seemed relieved and immediately started making plans for how he and Chloe would spend their first week alone in the house. As I packed my belongings that weekend, I found myself looking through old photo albums and memory boxes, trying to understand where our relationship had gone wrong. I found pictures of Danny's high school graduation, where he had thanked me in his speech for being his inspiration and his hero. I found the Mother's Day cards he had made me over the years, filled with promises to always love me and take care of me when I got older. The disconnect between those memories and our current reality was heartbreaking. Something had fundamentally changed in my son, and I couldn't figure out if it was Chloe's influence, his own growth into adulthood, or something I had done wrong as his mother. All I knew was that the boy who had once promised to protect me was now the one causing me the deepest pain I had ever experienced. On Sunday morning, as I loaded my suitcase into my car, Danny and Chloe stood on the front porch watching me leave. Chloe looked triumphant, like she had won some battle I hadn't even realized we were fighting. Danny looked uncomfortable, but determined, like he was convinced he was doing the right thing, even though it felt wrong. I hugged my son goodbye, and for just a moment, I felt him hesitate, felt his arms tighten around me like the little boy he used to be. But then Chloe cleared her throat behind us, and he stepped back, his walls going up again. As I drove away, from the house I had called home for over 15 years, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw them going back inside together, already making plans for their new life without me. I had no idea what the next chapter of my story would look like, but I knew that this painful ending was just the beginning of a journey that would teach me things about strength, independence, and love that I never could have imagined. What I didn't know then was that my departure would set in motion a series of events that would reveal the truth about Chloe's motivations, about Danny's struggles, and about the real reason my son had been so desperate to get me out of the house. The next few months would test everything I thought I knew about motherhood, sacrifice, and the complex dynamics of family loyalty. But in that moment, driving toward an uncertain future with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, I was just a mother trying to understand how love could hurt so deeply, and how the person you would die for could be the one who breaks your spirit into pieces. The Phoenix airport was bustling with travelers when I arrived that Sunday evening, my single suitcase feeling heavier with each step I took away from my old life. Maria was waiting for me at baggage claim, her face lighting. Up when she spotted me, though, I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in my appearance. I probably looked as broken as I felt, wearing the same clothes I'd been packing in all weekend, my hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, my eyes still red from crying during the flight. Maria didn't ask questions during the drive to her house in Scottsdale, instead filling the silence with updates about her job as a real estate agent, her husband Carlos's recent promotion, and their twin daughters who were now sophomores at Arizona State University. Her chatter was comforting, a reminder that life continued moving forward even when my own world felt like it had stopped spinning entirely. Her guest room was small, but comfortable, decorated in warm desert colors that felt nothing like the cold reception I'd received in my own home. That first night, as I unpacked my few belongings into the dresser Maria had cleared for me, I called Danny to let him know I had arrived safely. The conversation was awkward and brief, with him asking perfunctory questions about my flight while I could hear Chloe's voice in the background, asking him to help her move something heavy. The first week in Phoenix passed in a blur of trying to figure out my next steps, while Maria gently probed about what had really happened back home. I had told her that Danny and Chloe needed space and that I thought a change of scenery might be good for me, but she wasn't buying the casual explanation. Maria had always been perceptive, and she could sense that there was more to the story than I was willing to share. On my 8th day in Arizona, I finally broke down and told her everything. We were sitting on her back patio watching the sunset, paint the desert mountains in shades of orange and pink when the whole story came pouring out of me. I told her about Chloe's gradual takeover of my house, about Danny's transformation from loving son to demanding stranger, about the humiliation of being asked to leave my own home by the child I had sacrificed everything to raise. Maria listened without interruption, her expression growing more shocked and angry with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told me that what Danny had done was not only cruel, but potentially illegal, that I couldn't just abandon my house and my mortgage obligations because my son's girlfriend wanted more space. She urged me to contact a lawyer, to understand my rights as the homeowner, to protect myself financially even if Danny couldn't see past his infatuation. That conversation was the wake-up call I needed. I had been so focused on being the accommodating mother, on not standing in the way of Danny's happiness, that I had forgotten to protect my own interests. The next morning, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to a tenant rights attorney in Sacramento who agreed to consult with me over the phone about my situation. The second was to my manager at the grocery store, explaining that I needed to extend my leave of absence while dealing with a family emergency. The attorney, a sharp-voiced woman named Patricia Chen, was blunt in her assessment of my situation. She explained that regardless of who was living in the house, I remained legally and financially responsible for the mortgage payments. If I defaulted on the loan, it would destroy my credit and potentially leave me liable for the remaining balance if the house sold for less than what I owed. She advised me to return to Sacramento immediately and formally document my living situation, with Danny and Chloe, treating them as tenants who needed to contribute to household expenses. The idea of confronting Danny about paying rent felt foreign and uncomfortable, but Patricia's logic was sound. If he wanted to live in my house with his girlfriend, they needed to contribute to the expenses they were incurring. She also suggested that I document everything about our current arrangement, keeping records of any agreements we made about who was responsible for what costs. I spent the next few days researching rental prices in Sacramento, trying to determine what a fair market rate would be for my house. The numbers were eye-opening. Properties similar to mine were renting for nearly twice my monthly mortgage payment, and that didn't include utilities, maintenance, or property taxes. If Danny and Chloe were serious about living there long-term, they would need to contribute significantly more than I had been asking of them. Armed with this information, I called Danny to discuss my return to Sacramento. The conversation was tense from the beginning, with him asking why I was coming back so soon when I had said I might stay in Phoenix indefinitely. When I explained that I needed to handle some financial matters related to the house, he became defensive, asking if I was having second thoughts about our arrangement. I told him that we needed to sit down and work out a formal agreement about how expenses would be handled moving forward, that I couldn't continue paying the full mortgage while also trying to establish myself elsewhere. Danny's response revealed just how little he had considered the practical implications of his demands. He seemed genuinely surprised that I expected him to pay rent, arguing that he shouldn't have to pay to live in his childhood home. The entitlement in his voice was shocking. Somehow, in his mind, the years I had spent working multiple jobs to maintain our home had transformed it from my house into his inheritance, despite the fact that I still owed substantial money on the mortgage and would continue paying it for at least another decade. He seemed to think that reaching adulthood automatically granted him ownership rights to the property I was still financially responsible for. When I pressed him about whether he and Chloe could afford to contribute to household expenses, there was a long pause before he admitted that money was tighter than he had expected. He explained that Chloe had been spending significant amounts on redecorating the house, buying new furniture and accessories to replace the things she felt were outdated or embarrassing. They had also been eating out frequently and taking weekend trips to wine country, expenses that were straining his budget more than he had anticipated. The irony was painful. While I was sleeping in my sister's guest room and worrying about how to pay rent somewhere else, they were using my house as their personal playground, spending money on luxuries while expecting me to continue covering the basic costs of homeownership. I told Danny that I would be returning the following weekend and that we needed to have a serious conversation about our living arrangements and financial responsibilities. The flight back to Sacramento felt different from my departure 2 weeks earlier. Instead of the heartbroken, displaced mother who had left town with nowhere else to go, I was returning as a woman who understood her rights and was prepared to fight for them. Maria had spent hours helping me prepare for the conversations I needed to have, role-playing different scenarios and helping me find my voice after years of prioritizing everyone else's needs over my own. Danny picked me up at the airport, and the drive home was uncomfortably quiet. He looked tired and stressed, and I noticed that he had gotten a haircut and was wearing a new shirt that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 3 months. When I commented on his appearance, he explained that Chloe had been helping him update his wardrobe, saying that his previous style was too juvenile for someone in a serious relationship. The house looked different when we walked inside, and not in a good way. Chloe had indeed been redecorating, but instead of improving the space, she had erased every trace of the warm, lived-in feeling that had made it our home. The family photos were gone, replaced by generic art prints from discount stores. My comfortable furniture had been pushed into corners to make room for sleek, modern pieces that looked expensive but felt cold and unwelcoming. Most painfully, all evidence of Danny's childhood had been removed. The artwork I had carefully preserved from his school years was nowhere to be seen, replaced by minimalist decorations that could have come from any furniture showroom. The bookshelf that had held his favorite childhood books, his soccer trophies, and small mementos from our family adventures had been cleared completely, now displaying only Chloe's collection of scented candles and decorative objects. When I asked Danny where all of our personal items had gone, he explained somewhat sheepishly that Chloe had thought it was time to create a more mature living environment. He said that all of my photos and his childhood things had been carefully packed away in boxes in the garage, that nothing had been thrown away, just stored to make room for their new aesthetic vision. The casual way he dismissed decades of memories as clutter that needed to be hidden away was another small heartbreak in an already painful homecoming. This wasn't just redecorating. It was erasing our history, removing any evidence that I had ever lived in this house or that Danny had ever been a child who treasured the things his mother had saved for him. Chloe emerged from the master bedroom as we were talking, looking perfectly put together despite the fact that it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. She greeted me with false enthusiasm, acting as though my return was a pleasant surprise rather than something we had discussed in advance. She immediately launched into a tour of the changes she had made, pointing out each new purchase and explaining her design philosophy, as though I were a guest being shown around someone else's home. The transformation was jarring and expensive. New curtains hung in every window, coordinated throw pillows adorned the furniture, and decorative accessories filled every surface. When I asked about the cost of all these improvements, Chloe waved off my concern, saying that it was important to invest in creating a beautiful living environment and that she had gotten great deals on most of the items. Danny seemed proud of the changes, praising Chloe's eye for design and talking about how much more sophisticated the house looked now. He appeared oblivious to the fact that she had essentially erased our family's presence from the space, creating a showroom that looked like it belonged to strangers rather than the home where he had grown up. That night, I lay in the guest bedroom that had been designated as my space, staring at walls that had once been covered with Danny's childhood artwork, but were now painted a neutral beige that matched Chloe's aesthetic vision. The room felt foreign and unwelcoming, like I was staying in a hotel rather than my own home. I could hear them talking and laughing in the master bedroom, making plans for the upcoming week, discussing restaurants they wanted to try and events they wanted to attend. The next morning, I requested that we sit down for the financial conversation I had promised. Danny seemed reluctant to have this discussion, suggesting that maybe we could talk about it later in the week when he wasn't so busy with work deadlines. But I insisted that we address these issues immediately, explaining that I couldn't continue the current arrangement without clear agreements about responsibilities and expectations. Chloe joined us at the kitchen table, despite my suggestion that this was a conversation Danny and I needed to have privately. She said that since their living situation affected her directly, she wanted to be part of any decisions we made. Her presumption was breathtaking, but Danny didn't object to her presence, so I proceeded with the discussion I had planned. I laid out the financial realities of homeownership, explaining exactly what the monthly mortgage payment was, what utilities typically cost, and what percentage of his income would be required to cover his fair share of household expenses. I also showed them research I had done on comparable rental properties, demonstrating that they were essentially living in a house that would cost them significantly more to rent elsewhere. Danny's reaction was a mixture of shock and indignation. He seemed genuinely surprised by the amount of money it took to maintain the house, despite having lived there for most of his life. He argued that he shouldn't have to pay market rate rent to live in his childhood home, that family members shouldn't charge each other commercial rates for housing. Chloe's response was more calculated and manipulative. She suggested that perhaps I was being unreasonable in my expectations, that maybe the real solution was for me to sell the house and split the proceeds with Danny, since he was the one who would eventually inherit it anyway. She painted this as a generous compromise that would give me immediate access to cash while freeing them from the burden of rental payments. The suggestion that I should sell my home to accommodate their lifestyle preferences was so outrageous that I struggled to respond calmly. This was the house I had worked 3 jobs to afford, the place where I had raised my son as a single mother, the only significant asset I had managed to acquire in 52 years of life. The idea that I should liquidate my security to bankroll their relationship was beyond insulting. I explained that selling the house was not an option, that this was my home and my investment, and that if they wanted to continue living there, they needed to contribute to its maintenance and upkeep. I proposed a rental arrangement that would cover roughly 60% of the household expenses, leaving me responsible for the mortgage principal, but requiring them to cover utilities, property taxes, and maintenance costs. Even this reduced rate seemed to shock Danny, who calculated that his portion of the expenses would consume nearly half of his take-home pay. He complained that this would make it impossible for him to save money or enjoy the lifestyle he had worked hard to achieve. Chloe added that they had already invested so much money in improving the house that they shouldn't be expected to pay additional rent on top of their decorating expenses. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Danny and Chloe presenting increasingly creative arguments for why they shouldn't have to pay market rates to live in my house. They suggested that my mortgage payments should be considered an investment that I was making for my own benefit, that their presence in the house was actually helping me by preventing break-ins and maintaining the property, and that asking them to pay rent was essentially punishing Danny for choosing to stay close to family instead of moving out entirely. Throughout this discussion, I was struck by how entitled they both seemed, how completely they had reimagined our situation to cast themselves as the victims of my unreasonable demands. In their minds, I was being selfish and vindictive by expecting them to contribute financially to the household they had essentially taken over. Finally, Danny asked for time to think about the proposal and discuss it with Chloe privately. He said they needed to look at their budget and figure out whether they could afford to live in the house under the terms I was suggesting. The fact that this was even a question, that they might decide they couldn't afford to pay rent in the house they had demanded I leave, highlighted the absurdity of the entire situation. That evening, while they were out at dinner at yet another expensive restaurant, I walked through the house and really looked at what Chloe had done to our home. Every room told the same story of erasure and replacement, of a young woman systematically removing evidence of the family that had lived there before her arrival. It wasn't just redecorating, it was colonization, a deliberate effort to claim territory and mark it as her own. In the garage, I found the boxes Danny had mentioned, filled with our family photos, his childhood artwork, and small treasures from his growing up years. Seeing these precious memories relegated to storage containers was heartbreaking, but it also strengthened my resolve to fight for my place in this house and in my son's life. Over the next few days, I began documenting everything about our living situation, taking photos of the expensive items Chloe had purchased, keeping receipts for groceries and utilities, and maintaining a written record of conversations about household responsibilities. Patricia Chen had advised me to treat this like any other landlord-tenant relationship, protecting myself legally and financially regardless of the family dynamics involved. Danny seemed increasingly stressed as the week progressed, and I began to suspect that the conversation about rent had forced him to confront financial realities he had been avoiding. He was working long hours and coming home tired and irritable, snapping at both Chloe and me over minor issues. Chloe, meanwhile, seemed determined to maintain the illusion that everything was perfect, continuing to make expensive purchases and plan costly outings despite their apparent budget concerns. On Friday evening, Danny asked to speak with me privately. Chloe was at her book club, giving us a rare opportunity to talk without her input or oversight. He looked exhausted and older than his 24 years as he sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals over the years. He began by acknowledging that the financial realities of maintaining the house were more complex than he had realized, that he had perhaps been naive about the costs involved in homeownership. He admitted that Chloe's decorating expenses had strained their budget more than he had expected, and that paying rent on top of their current spending would be challenging. But then he said something that broke my heart all over again. He explained that Chloe had been struggling with the situation more than she had let on, that she felt uncomfortable living in a house where she would always be seen as an outsider, where every room held memories of his childhood with another woman. He said that she needed to feel like she had a real home with him, not just a place where she was temporarily tolerated. The way he described our situation, with me as the interloper standing in the way of their happiness, was so distorted from my perspective that I struggled to recognize the family dynamics he was describing. In his mind, Chloe was the victim of an uncomfortable living situation, and I was the obstacle preventing them from building the life they deserved together. He proposed a different solution, one that he presented as a compromise but felt like another betrayal. He suggested that maybe I could move to Phoenix permanently, that I seemed happier and more relaxed during my time with Maria, and that starting fresh in a new city might be exactly what I needed at this stage of my life. He offered to take over the mortgage payments and handle all the household expenses, essentially buying me out of my own home for the remaining mortgage balance. The offer was presented as generous, but the numbers didn't add up in my favor. I would lose all the equity. I had built over 15 years of payments, walking away with just enough money to cover a security deposit and first month's rent somewhere else. Meanwhile, Danny and Chloe would gain ownership of a house that was worth significantly more than the remaining mortgage balance, essentially receiving a substantial gift funded by my decades of sacrifice. When I pointed out the financial inequity of his proposal, Danny seemed genuinely confused about why I would object to his terms. He argued that he was offering to relieve me of the burden of home ownership, freeing me to pursue new adventures without being tied down by mortgage payments and maintenance responsibilities. He painted my attachment to the house as nostalgia, that was preventing me from embracing new opportunities. The conversation ended without resolution, with Danny saying he needed to discuss the options with Chloe and figure out what would work best for everyone involved. As I listened to him talk about our family's future like a business transaction that needed to be optimized for maximum efficiency, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship that might never be repaired. That weekend, while they were away on another expensive trip to Napa Valley, I spent time alone in the house trying to understand what had happened to my son and how our bond had become so fractured. I looked through the photo albums Chloe had banished to the garage, remembering the little boy who used to tell me he loved me every single day, who used to bring me flowers he picked from our garden, who used to promise that he would always take care of me when I got old. I also began researching my options more thoroughly, looking into the legal protections available to homeowners, understanding my rights if Danny and Chloe continued refusing to pay reasonable rental rates, and exploring what it would take to formally evict tenants who weren't contributing to household expenses. The more I learned about landlord-tenant law, the more I realized that I had been approaching this situation as a mother rather than a property owner, prioritizing family harmony over my own financial security. But Danny and Chloe weren't treating me like family. They were treating me like an inconvenient previous tenant who needed to be managed until they could take full control of the property. On Sunday evening, when they returned from their weekend getaway, I was ready for a different kind of conversation. Instead of pleading for understanding or accepting whatever crumbs of consideration they were willing to offer, I was prepared to assert my rights as the homeowner and demand the respect I deserved as the woman who had made their comfortable lifestyle possible. But what I discovered when they walked through the door would change everything I thought I knew about their relationship, about Danny's behavior over the past year, and about the real reasons Chloe had been so determined to get me out of the house. The truth was more complicated and more heartbreaking than I could have imagined, and it would force me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about my son's betrayal. As they came through the front door, laughing and carrying shopping bags from their weekend trip, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Chloe was wearing a diamond ring on her left hand that definitely hadn't been there when they left on Friday. The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized existed suddenly began falling into place, and I understood that my displacement from this house had been about much more than just creating space for a young couple to build their relationship. This had been a carefully orchestrated plan with a timeline and objectives I was only beginning to comprehend. And the next few weeks would reveal just how deep the deception ran and how much my son had been keeping from me about his real situation. The diamond ring sparkled under our kitchen lights as Chloe unpacked their weekend purchases, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just any ring. It was clearly an engagement ring, substantial and expensive, the kind of purchase that would require months of saving or significant debt. As I watched her carefully avoid making eye contact with me while showing off various items they had bought in Napa Valley, the pieces of a much larger puzzle began clicking into place. Danny was moving around the kitchen with nervous energy, putting away wine bottles and gourmet foods they had purchased, chattering about the wineries they had visited and the restaurants where they had dined. But I noticed he kept glancing at Chloe's left hand with an expression that wasn't joy or pride. It was anxiety mixed with something that looked almost like regret. I waited until they had finished unpacking before casually commenting on Chloe's beautiful new jewelry. Her face lit up with the kind of radiant smile that would have been appropriate for a newly engaged woman, but Danny's reaction was telling. He froze completely, his shoulders tensing as he waited to see how this conversation would unfold. Chloe launched into an elaborate story about how Danny had surprised her with a proposal during a sunset dinner overlooking the vineyards, how romantic and perfect the entire weekend had been, how they were planning a spring wedding at a venue they had already toured. She spoke with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had rehearsed this announcement. But something about her delivery felt artificial, like she was performing rather than sharing genuine excitement. Danny remained unusually quiet during Chloe's recounting of their engagement, occasionally nodding or offering brief confirmations when she looked to him for support. This wasn't the behavior I would have expected from a man who had just proposed to the love of his life. Instead of glowing with happiness, he seemed burdened by the weight of the commitment he had apparently made. As I listened to Chloe describe their wedding plans, I began to understand why my removal from the house had been so urgent and non-negotiable. This wasn't about a young couple needing space to grow their relationship. This was about a woman who needed to establish complete territorial control before bringing Danny's family into a wedding celebration. She couldn't risk having me present, as a witness to their daily dynamics, couldn't afford to have anyone who might question whether this marriage was what Danny really wanted. The timeline made perfect sense now. The gradual escalation of complaints about my presence, the increasing pressure for me to relocate, the systematic erasure of our family history from the house. It had all been building toward this moment, when Chloe would become Danny's fiancée and eventually his wife. She needed to be sure that when that transition happened, I would be safely marginalized and unable to interfere with her plans. Over the next few days, I watched their interactions with new understanding, paying attention to details I had previously overlooked. Danny seemed more stressed than ever, working longer hours and coming home exhausted. When I asked him about wedding planning, he deflected the questions or gave vague responses about how Chloe was handling most of the details. For someone who had supposedly just gotten engaged to his soulmate, he showed remarkably little enthusiasm for discussing their future together. Chloe, meanwhile, was in full wedding planning mode, making lists and phone calls, researching vendors and venues. But when I offered to help with any of the preparations, she quickly declined, saying that she and her mother had everything under control. The message was clear. This was her event, her celebration, and my participation was neither wanted nor welcome. The financial implications of their engagement also became more apparent as the week progressed. Wedding planning was expensive, and Chloe seemed determined to have the kind of elaborate celebration that would require significant financial resources. She was booking vendors and making deposits with the casual confidence of someone who wasn't worried about the costs involved. When I gently asked Danny how they were planning to afford a wedding while also taking on household expenses, his response revealed the depth of the financial pressure he was under. He admitted that they had already spent most of his savings on the engagement ring and initial wedding deposits, and that paying rent to me would make it impossible for them to continue funding their wedding plans. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life, not because of what Danny said, but because of what he didn't say. He explained that Chloe had given him an ultimatum about their living situation, that she couldn't marry him while feeling like a guest in his mother's house, that she needed to know they had a real home together before she could commit to a future with him. He talked about their relationship like it was a business deal with terms and conditions that had to be met before the contract could be finalized. There was no mention of love or mutual support, no discussion of building a partnership based on shared values and goals. Instead, he described a series of requirements that Chloe had established and that he was scrambling to fulfill before she changed her mind about marrying him. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking. This wasn't a man celebrating his engagement to his beloved partner. This was someone who was terrified of losing something he wasn't even sure he wanted to keep. When I asked him directly if he was happy about getting married, his answer was telling. He said that Chloe made him want to be a better man, that she challenged him to grow and improve himself, that she had shown him what a sophisticated adult relationship could look like. None of those responses actually answered my question about happiness. They were all about what Chloe wanted from him and how he was trying to transform himself to meet her expectations. There was no mention of what he wanted from the relationship or how she supported his goals and dreams. That night, I lay awake thinking about the little boy Danny had once been, trying to reconcile those memories with the anxious, people-pleasing man he had become. Something had gone wrong in my parenting, some failure on my part that had left him vulnerable to manipulation by someone who recognized his desperate need for approval and acceptance. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to argue about rental payments or living arrangements, I decided to have a completely honest conversation with Danny about what I was observing in his relationship and my concerns about his apparent unhappiness. I waited until Chloe left for work, then asked Danny to sit with me in our backyard where we used to spend summer evenings when he was young. The garden was overgrown now, another casualty of the chaos that had consumed our household over the past year, but it still held the peaceful energy that had made it our favorite place for serious conversations. I told Danny that I loved him, unconditionally, and that my primary concern was his well-being, not my own comfort or living situation. I explained that I had been watching him carefully since returning from Phoenix, and that I was worried about the level of stress and anxiety he seemed to be carrying. I asked him to be honest with me about whether he was truly happy with the direction his life was taking. For a long moment, Danny was quiet, staring at his hands and struggling with emotions he had been suppressing for months. When he finally looked up at me, I saw the little boy I remembered, scared and confused, and looking for guidance from the one person who had always been his safe harbor. He began to tell me a story that was completely different from the narrative Chloe had been presenting about their relationship. He explained that the engagement hadn't been his idea, that Chloe had been pressuring him about marriage for months, making it clear that she wouldn't continue the relationship unless he made a formal commitment. The romantic proposal in Napa Valley had actually been orchestrated by Chloe, who had selected the ring, chosen the restaurant, and essentially scripted the entire weekend. Danny admitted that he had been feeling trapped for months, caught between his fear of losing Chloe and his growing realization that their relationship was based more on her demands and expectations than on mutual love and respect. He said that every conversation about their future focused on what he needed to do differently, what he needed to provide, what he needed to sacrifice to make her happy. The financial pressure was even worse than I had imagined. Chloe had expensive tastes and little concern for budgetary constraints, expecting Danny to fund a lifestyle that was far beyond his means. The engagement ring alone had cost him 3 months' salary, money he had borrowed against his credit cards because Chloe had insisted that anything smaller would be embarrassing. As Danny continued talking, I began to understand that his treatment of me hadn't really been about choosing Chloe over his mother. It had been about a desperate young man trying to meet impossible demands from someone who had convinced him that love required constant sacrifice and submission. Chloe had systematically isolated him from anyone who might offer alternative perspectives or support, starting with me as the person who knew him best and loved him most unconditionally. The request for me to leave the house hadn't originated. With Danny, it had been Chloe's requirement, presented as a test of his commitment to their relationship. She had convinced him that asking me to relocate was a necessary step toward proving he was ready to be a real partner, rather than a mama's boy who couldn't make adult decisions independently. When I asked Danny what he actually wanted, separate from Chloe's expectations and demands, he broke down completely. He admitted that he missed our relationship, that he missed feeling comfortable and accepted in his own home, that he missed being able to make decisions without worrying about whether they would meet someone else's approval. He also revealed something that explained so much about the past year's dynamics. Chloe had been systematically criticizing every aspect of his life that connected him to me, from his casual clothing style to his preference for simple home-cooked meals to his habit of calling me when he was stressed about work. She had convinced him that these were signs of immaturity, that he needed to outgrow if he wanted to be worthy of a sophisticated woman's love. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Danny gradually opening up about doubts and concerns he had been suppressing for months. He talked about feeling like he was constantly walking on eggshells, never sure what might trigger Chloe's disappointment or anger. He described a relationship where his value was measured entirely by his ability to provide material comforts and social status, rather than by who he was as a person. As I listened to my son describe the emotional prison he had constructed for himself, I felt a mixture of heartbreak and relief. Heartbreak because I could see how much pain he had been carrying, and relief because the loving, thoughtful boy I had raised was still there underneath the anxiety and people-pleasing behavior. But I also realized that simply offering Danny emotional support wouldn't be enough to help him escape this situation. Chloe had invested too much time and energy in molding him into the partner she wanted, and she wouldn't give up easily when she realized he was questioning their relationship. The wedding planning, the financial commitments, the public announcements to family and friends, they were all designed to make it increasingly difficult for Danny to change his mind about marriage. That evening, when Chloe returned from work, she immediately sensed that something had shifted in the household dynamics. Danny was quieter than usual during dinner, and when she tried to engage him in wedding planning discussions, he was notably less enthusiastic than he had been in previous days. She kept glancing between us suspiciously, clearly wondering what we had discussed during her absence. After dinner, I heard them having a tense conversation in the master bedroom, with Chloe's voice becoming increasingly sharp and demanding as she tried to understand why Danny seemed different. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was familiar from arguments I had witnessed between them before, with Chloe lecturing and Danny apologizing for whatever he had done wrong. The next morning, Chloe announced that she thought it would be best if I made concrete plans to relocate as soon as possible, that having me in the house was creating unnecessary stress during an already overwhelming time of wedding planning. She suggested that my continued presence was making it difficult for them to focus on their future together, and that a clean break would be healthier for everyone involved. But this time, Danny didn't immediately agree with her assessment. Instead, he said that maybe they should slow down the timeline for major changes, that there was no rush to make permanent decisions about living arrangements while they were dealing with so many other transitions. His mild pushback against Chloe's demands was clearly unexpected, and I watched her struggle to maintain her composure while processing this new dynamic. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became increasingly unbearable. Chloe was frustrated by Danny's sudden reluctance to finalize plans that had previously been settled, and Danny was clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties and expectations. Meanwhile, I was trying to navigate the delicate balance between supporting my son and avoiding any actions that might make his situation more difficult. The breaking point came when Chloe discovered that Danny had been researching options for postponing their wedding, looking into vendor cancellation policies and deposit recovery procedures. She confronted him directly, demanding to know why he was having second thoughts about their marriage and whether I had been poisoning his mind against her during our private conversations. The argument that followed was explosive with Chloe, accusing me of manipulating Danny and sabotaging their relationship out of jealousy and possessiveness. She claimed that I couldn't accept his growth into an independent adult, and that I was trying to keep him emotionally dependent on me rather than allowing him to build a healthy partnership with someone else. Danny's response surprised both of us. Instead of apologizing and trying to smooth things over as he had done countless times before, he stood up for himself and for our relationship. He told Chloe that his doubts about marriage had nothing to do with my influence, and everything to do with his growing realization that their relationship was built on demands and conditions rather than love and acceptance. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Chloe ultimately giving Danny an ultimatum that would force him to choose definitively between maintaining his relationship with me and moving forward with their engagement. She told him that if he wasn't ready to prioritize their future together over his attachment to his childhood, then maybe they weren't meant to be married after all. But what happened next revealed the true depth of Chloe's manipulation and the extent to which she had been planning to control not just Danny's living situation, but his entire future. In her anger and frustration, she said something that exposed the calculated nature of her entire relationship with my son. something that made it clear she had never loved him for who he was, only for what he could provide for her. She admitted that she had been planning their engagement timeline around gaining legal access to the house, that marrying Danny was the most efficient way to secure her claim to the property that she saw as her pathway to the kind of lifestyle she felt she deserved. She revealed that she had never intended for their marriage to be an equal partnership, but rather a transaction that would give her the security and status she wanted while relieving Danny of the burden of making decisions about his own life. The mask finally slipped completely, and Danny was able to see clearly what I had been observing for months. Chloe wasn't the sophisticated woman who was helping him grow into a better version of himself. She was a predator who had identified him as an easy target for financial and emotional exploitation. The weeks that followed were difficult, but transformative. Danny ended the engagement and asked Chloe to move out of the house, a process that involved significant financial losses and uncomfortable conversations with vendors and family members who had been informed about the wedding plans. But for the first time in months, I saw genuine relief and happiness in my son's face as he began to reclaim his own life and priorities. The process of rebuilding our relationship wasn't immediate or simple. Danny had to work through guilt about how he had treated me, and I had to forgive him for choices that had caused real pain and financial stress. We both had to learn new ways of relating to each other that acknowledged his adult independence, while maintaining the love and connection that had always been the foundation of our bond. Today, almost a year later, Danny still lives in the house with me, but our arrangement is completely different from the uncomfortable dynamic we had during Chloe's residence. He pays a fair portion of household expenses, contributes to maintenance and improvements, and treats our home as a shared space rather than his personal domain. He's dating someone new, a kind woman named Sarah who treats both of us with respect and who genuinely seems to enjoy Danny's company rather than trying to change fundamental aspects of his personality. Most importantly, Danny has learned to trust his own instincts about relationships and to recognize the difference between someone who loves him for who he is and someone who sees him as a project to be improved or a resource to be exploited. The experience with Chloe was painful, but it taught him valuable lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and the importance of maintaining connections with people who love him unconditionally. Looking back on those difficult months, I realize that my willingness to leave the house and give Danny space to make his own mistakes was actually one of the most loving things I could have done for him. By not fighting Chloe directly or trying to force Danny to see her true nature, I allowed him to discover for himself what kind of relationship he really wanted and what kind of partner would make him genuinely happy. The house is filled with warmth and laughter again, decorated with a mixture of our old family photos and new memories we're creating together. Danny has matured in real ways, not the artificial sophistication that Chloe demanded, but genuine growth that comes from learning to value himself and the people who truly care about his well-being. Sometimes the greatest act of love is stepping back and allowing someone you care about to find their own way back to you, even when every instinct tells you to fight for them. Danny had to learn for himself that real love doesn't require constant sacrifice or submission, that a healthy relationship should enhance who you are, rather than demanding that you become someone completely different. Our story didn't end with the dramatic confrontation or the painful revelation of Chloe's true motives. It continued with the slower, more meaningful work of rebuilding trust, establishing new boundaries, and creating a family dynamic that honors both Danny's independence and our enduring connection. We're stronger now than we were before this crisis, not because we avoided conflict, but because we worked through it together and emerged with a deeper understanding of what really matters in our relationship. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.